Welcome to Oh the Humanities, a podcast produced by the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. Our conversations are devoted to shining a light on the important work being done in the humanities at UNE and other colleges across the U.S. and around the world. My name is Josh Pahigian, and I'm your host. Our guest today is University of New England English professor Susan McHugh, who joins me in studio on UNE's beautiful Biddeford campus. Susan's scholarship, which explores portrayals of animals and plants in literature, opens new ways for us to think about non-human beings. Susan has delivered invited lectures all around the world. She is the author of such books as Love in a Time of Slaughters, Human-Animal Stories Against Extinction and Genocide, Animal Stories, Narrating Across Species Lines, and Dog, a volume in Reaction Books' groundbreaking animal series. Susan has also published dozens of essays and book chapters and is the co-editor of two book series, Palgrave Studies in Animals and Literature, the first academic book series devoted to literary animal studies, and Plants and Animals Interdisciplinary Perspectives, published by Peter Lang. Most recently, Susan penned a book chapter that will appear within Plant Poetics, Literary Forms and Functions of the Vegetal, which will be released by Brill in July 2025, just a couple of weeks after we're speaking now. And we'll get into the weeds of that piece shortly. But first, let's meet our guest. Susan, welcome to Oh the Humanities. How are you today?
Wonderful, Josh. Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So I understand last week you had some interviews, maybe similar to this one, with outfits in Sweden and Russia. Talking, I think, about animals in literature. Is that right?
That's right. Some friends at Södertörn University have got a group together to work on a project that they're provisionally titling Writing an Animal-Centered Swedish Literary History. And they brought me in to reflect on how literary animal studies came about in the first place. That was a wonderful, vibrant group of 20 or more people who will be contributing chapters ultimately to a book project. And then just this last Sunday, a group from the art museum called Garage in Moscow, Russia, brought me in as part of a speaker series on human-animal studies, which is very new to the Russian context, the Russian-speaking world. And there, too, it was a bunch of young, excited people who are really curious to hear from an old-timer about how to break down some boundaries, to reach across differences, and to really help develop what is fast becoming a very vibrant area of research in the humanities.
I don't think of you as an old-timer, more like a contemporary, but I understand that the field has evolved quite a bit in the couple of decades that you've been in it as a scholar. Could you speak a little bit more about that? And we'll get around to how you've branched into plant studies before too long. But animal studies, which is really where you initially made your mark with your first book, Dog, and so on, and the others that I mentioned. How has the field? It's a very interdisciplinary field, I think. And where do you trace its origins to? Studying how animals are reflected and how they're presented in the literature that we consume.
Yeah, I was really lucky in retrospect that when I graduated, several of us were just emerging with various projects across the arts and humanities who were lucky enough to find each other right at the turn of the 21st century, coincidentally, I guess. But not really coincidentally, because there had been many people of the generation before who were working in a way that felt very alone and very isolated and very silenced, but nonetheless did solid, good work that the rest of us coming along in the next generation were able to cite in our projects, to convince our advisors that, no, this is real, this is important, and this is something that is in need of development. But truth be told, for me, the story that I tell in the introduction to Animal Stories still needs to be told, and that is, for me, literary animal studies began in an undergraduate literature classroom of all the places. It was a survey course in British literature, and we were reading that day a very forgettable poem by William Wordsworth titled Nutting. And the professor was really leaning on us to talk, to discuss it. And I ventured forth. I was a very shy undergraduate, and so it was unusual for me to speak that day, but I ventured an interpretation of the poem as a squirrel's reflection on seasonal change. "That's insane," said the truly venerable professor as the class went silent. "Animals don't think, and they certainly don't write poetry." Mic drop.
Yeah, wow.
Yikes, it was a harsh rebuke, and yet I understand in retrospect that the question that I was raising in a place where this question was sacrosanct is the question that was coming to a crisis in the 20th century, namely, what is the human? And for my professor, again, in retrospect, it all makes sense. And in the moment, of course, it didn't feel that way. But my professor was a Jewish veteran of World War II. He was an American immigrant, and he was a pioneering feminist studies scholar. His entire life, you could say, had been devoted to fighting for more equitable and more inclusive answers to that question, what is the human? And here I was coming along to say, well, maybe
the squirrel was a bridge too far for him, though, at that point in his evolution.
But me, raised on Jane Goodall, and spending quite a lot of my time as a child outdoors and not in human company, in non-human company, it seemed obvious.
Could you tell us about some of the experiences you had with animals growing up that gave you a little bit more sensitivity and openness to seeing the world or some parts of it through their lens? Did you have pets, or did you know horses and farm animals? How did you gain that ability to relate to the animal?
Yeah, in retrospect, I had the most magical childhood for this kind of work, in part because, we tried to get in as many pets as our parents would allow, and they were pretty firm about. So there were some hard nopes, but over time they came to realize, too, that both of them had come from farming families, and they understood the suburban culture that they had chosen to raise us in had its limits as well. And to get us out, to get us to enjoy the parts of their childhoods that they loved so much. Eventually, our family happened into horses, but, we're not the rich people type having horses. This was having to work as children to work off our board to take care of them. So I think now about how strange, in contrast to a lot of people, it was that I would go for hours, days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months in the summer holidays, dropped off at horse barns in the countryside, expected to take care of the horses, our horses, other people's horses, but also there's cats, there's dogs, there's chickens, ducks, and goats sometimes. And as part of that life also, in sharing these spaces, sharing food for ourselves, the animals, and other resources, I ended up in other people's barns and farms, family-run farms they were in those days. And in those places, cows and pigs were still living outdoors. So that's not something that you can see or experience anymore. But for me, that was a really... I appreciate the difference between what the industry now expects of animals versus what makes them happy and what they expect in life and enjoy. And I think, too, in thinking this way, it's also very important to me to recognize that world ended for me when I went away to college. So when I got to college, unlike a lot of my peers, I had a lot of catching up to do and learning about human animals. So I tell that story about my professor, but I have to stop and say, look, he did really well considering what he was working with and his colleagues. And yes, I had an excellent education. And yet, as part of that, they really didn't crush that curiosity and that love and that passion that I have for the non-human world. And I think also, too, that, like I said, being raised on Jane Goodall, on nature films, on, living in a particularly beautiful moment at the end of the 20th century, I was privy to a lot of new ways of knowing the world and new science and new understandings that are also reflected in that anecdote, I think.
Yeah, that's a great story to sort of frame your growth into the realm that you've made your career in. So your first book, Dog, comes out, and how many languages has that been translated into now? I remember talking to you a while back, and it had already been translated into a few. But do you have what are a few of the languages that Dog has been translated into? Because I think that speaks to its universal appeal.
Yeah, again, it's really, really lucky for me, and I'm very, very fortunate to have been selected early on in that series. The editor of it, who is now a great friend, told me that he picked me on purpose as a subversive person to do a normal animal, because they had to have normal animals to start out the series. It's up to over 100 volumes now, so there's all kinds of animals. But yeah, to have been in on the ground floor there and to have that opportunity to shape the way that series would go was wonderful. I also got incredibly lucky because it's a small, handcrafted, individual-owned publisher in the heart of London, and they did things in a quirky manner, including to, in the contract, write in for me that I would get 50% of whatever translations they negotiated, which allowed me to pay off my student loans, which most academic authors don't get to do with their writing, because it was published in French, Spanish, Italian, Turkish, Chinese, and Russian.
Incredible.
I know. Very lucky for a first book.
Yeah. How would you characterize the book for listeners that aren't familiar with it and that might be thinking about going online and picking up a copy? If you had to describe it in a few sentences, what's the elevator pitch?
The series itself, to be clear, is a cultural history of species, so it could easily have been written and devised in a very different, very traditional scientific way, but by emphasizing the cultural role of, and each volume is devoted to a different species. So the cultural history of dogs is a particularly challenging one, I discovered after I took it on, because as you go back in history, as far as we can go in virtually every culture, every continent, humans are accompanied by dogs. Going back in the archaeological record, burial sites of humans also indicate cohabitation of dogs. So to go back to that question of what is the human, well, one answer that I like to give is we don't know what the human is apart from in the company of dogs. And with that perspective, the knee-jerk reaction of especially dog haters to trivialize or to say that you're over-sentimentalizing or anthropomorphizing if you care about dogs, well, the history of dogs says quite otherwise, simply because we're so dependent on them, codependent on them in so many wonderful ways. And yeah, there's so many stories to tell. And again, as a global history of anything, they are really quite amazing because they're continuing on and helping us to develop our stories further.
Well, I have a dog in my household, so I can definitely relate to the way they are part of the family, part of the culture, and part of what makes us human in the 21st century. Your other two monographs, how would you characterize those briefly for listeners that are just trying to learn more about you?
So Animal Stories was something that I started before the dog book. And the dog book actually was a grand distraction and a good diversion for me to learn how to write a book, because Animal Stories was even deeper in my heart, partly because its roots were in my dissertation. And the struggle was so real in those days to be taken seriously as an academic who's curious about this. And it took me a long time to think about the structure of that book. So for that book, just a few pieces, mostly towards the end of it, came from my dissertation. I really had to write the whole first half and the framing of it in the 12 years that ensued after I finished my PhD. And what I came up with was thinking about animals in urban industrial contexts and sort of the rise of interest in what animals are still doing in the human world as we supposedly are making it increasingly more modern and human. I started to realize that there are a few stellar examples of how there were brand new modern relationships in between humans and animals that really are premised on our development of technology and concentration in cities, namely the people's use of guide dogs, specifically seeing eye dogs. One particular training method proved really helpful to me to think about how this is a mutually enhancing and empowering relationship. And the other one that was closer to my experience, but a little more fraught to put together, is the association of women and girls and horses. If you look back in the historical record, there is one or two European paintings of women and girls prominently featured with horses. Everything else, it's all men and all war, technology and hauling. Of course, that all makes sense. But why the pivot in the 20th century? And to give yourselves the test, go into any toy store, ask yourself what side are the horses on, the pink side or the blue side,
yeah.
right? Bronies are a thing, and yes, I'm not saying that it has to be this way, but as someone whose method is to look at stories and look for patterns across them, gather together stories on a subject, looking for the patterns, that was a striking turn. And so the first half of the book really looks at what I term the intersubjective relationships between two individuals that are doing something more than the individual pieces can account for, and in many ways are idolized in the culture. But in some ways, too, there is resistance to this as a new hybrid human-animal ideal. The second half of the book takes a look at the context in which these stories are arising, and that is thinking about intercorporeal relations, as I call them, really more bodily, shared, beyond our intellectual capacity kind of thing. And for that, I looked at more traditional relationships that have adapted to modern environments, namely dog breeding and people's involvements in as breeders, how that has to adapt to urban and suburban environments. And then finally to turn to Animal Farm. Everyone always wants me to talk about Animal Farm.
It was in the back of my mind. Yeah, very anthropomorphized animals. Yeah.
It's such a good novel for so many reasons, but that anchors a chapter on meat production and how meat production radically changes in the 20th century. As we all know now, thanks to COVID, not least because it's so much more dangerous in terms of pathogens and in terms of zoonotic diseases.
Factory farms, yeah.
Yeah. And it's certainly the case looking back at the early 20th century and through that whole century, that authors as much as scientists were very aware of the dangers and of what the broader social as well as medical and other implications are of these changes. They recognize the changes as momentous. But I think, too, what literary writers do a really specially good job of, writers like George Orwell, author of Animal Farm, they're very aware that these social and natural or unnatural histories are inseparable and something that we're doing ourselves a disservice if we try to compartmentalize them.
So your scholarship dovetails with your teaching, of course, and I know your classes are always very highly enrolled. Students are pretty eager to get into your classes. What are a couple of the classes that you've taught recently that you've found energizing, and why do you think, other than the fact that you're an engaging person and great teacher, why do you think there's so much interest in the current generation of students in the type of work you're doing?
Oh, Josh, you are too kind. We have wonderful students here at UNE. I'll just put that one out there. And what's wonderful actually about teaching literature here at UNE is our students are always an interdisciplinary mix, not just within any given group, but in and of themselves. They are people who are curious about marine science, and they also care about the environment. They are students who want to become physicians, but they're going to stay poets. They're committed as writers, too. I mean, these are really wonderful folks to be working with, so young and so just excited and enthusiastic. So I know that I can push their limits sometimes, push them out of their comfort zones. And there was a wonderful experience in my Literatures of the Sea class recently. I do a lot of critterly stuff. I'm a curious creature, so I'm attracted to that and present them with a lot of interesting things, I hope. But yeah, there was this Rachel Ingalls novel that a friend of mine had recently sort of stumbled across and shared with me because it is just so curious. It's a woman's intimate relationship with a sea creature, and of course there was this recent Hollywood movie, The Shape of Water, I think, that won.
I didn't see it, but I remember seeing the title somewhere. Yeah.
So it's basically the same exact story, only it's set instead of the female character being deaf in the 1940s. This one is a very long-suffering housewife. The story itself is set in like the 60s, but it was written in the 1980s. And what's so curious about all of these woman and the sea creature thing is there's a lot of these stories, which is one curious thing.
It's a genre, yeah.
Right, but every single author of them claims that they had no idea about the earlier ones, which is always fun, right? Yeah, sure, or okay, imagine that.
My work is not derivative, please.
Right. But it was really sweet to see how my students recognized that the feminist critique in it and the animal rights critique in it, and this is from the 1980s, this is pretty early for both of these things to be coming together, are really important to the narrative. And the creature, whose name is Larry, they loved that. Call me Larry.
Very mundane name for exotic creature. Yeah.
They recognize that he's deliberately cast as vegan, that he's, by the end, the most sympathetic creature in the narrative, and they're rooting for him by the end of it, too, which in some of the iterations of this story aren't necessarily the way that they go. So thinking together with my students about why this particular writer would want, especially at that moment in history, to be telling this kind of story in this particular way was just so much fun. And it just led to some really interesting questions, not least of which is, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to us, McHugh? Why are you reading this? So going back to say, okay, yeah, it's creepy and weird, but why does this writer want us to feel uncomfortable? And what is she actually making us feel uncomfortable about? That really, I think, helped to drill it down into some pretty productive conversations.
I think I want to audit one of your classes now, or at least borrow the reading list. It would be my summer reading. So you're this expert in animals and literature, yet recently you've switched to also expand your lens and also look at and consider plants in literature. How did you make that shift? What was there a moment where you felt like you had done enough with animals, or you just realized there was this classification of organic beings that you had not been paying as much attention to as you could have been, that you thought deserved some scholarly scrutiny? How did you make that shift as a scholar in mid-career, as it were?
It's a great question. And yeah, it kind of looks like the trajectory of my work is to go from animals to plants. It's certainly the way that these two fields have been evolving, and unfortunately not quite co-evolving as much as they could have been doing all along and can be doing as we move forward. It's all been of a piece to me. So even before I published, I think in between Dog and Animal Stories, is still in the single digits years of the 2000s, I published an article on genetically modified potato narratives, centered mostly on Ruth Ozeki, a Japanese-American novelist's very big, sprawling book titled All Over Creation, which tells the story of the first ever genetically modified crop plant introduced to the American consumers and almost immediately taken off the market. It was, I'm going to get this wrong, it's a Monsanto product, and it's either the New Life or the New Leaf. One of them, I think New Leaf is the fictional one.
Either kind of works, yeah.
Right. And it is, I think, a really interesting intergenerational story, really interesting story of the rise of genetic modification technologies and the demise of the family farm in the U.S. But also, too, she's clever enough to introduce this gardener character in it, and this group of vegan activists who are ultimately involved in the WTO protests of the Occupy movement. And that is really, I think, just spot on with where America was at the moment. So it's a fun novel to teach and a fun novel to read. But in writing about it, it also was bringing me back to what has driven my interest all along also in animal stories, which is how scientific modeling really has to be creative in order to get the most out of that activity. So it's an excuse in each case as I'm researching these stories to think about, well, what's the science behind some of this and what is supported by these novelists? And quite often the novelists are engaged with it too, which makes it really curious. So she has as a key intertext in it this famous plant developer, Luther Burbank. His autobiography is being read by and quoted by some of the characters in the story. He's the person who's responsible for the Burbank russet potato, which is the origin of the 4-inch French fry that we all require of fast food restaurants now. But the Shasta daisy and so many other plants. This funky guy in the early 20th century. It's a real American story, but one that's also, again, quite global in reach, which is what plants and plant stories can do for you as well. Something I think that has made plant studies really take off as we get in towards the middle of the 21st century now is the really obvious overlap, much less so with animals and livestock even, of colonization and how decolonial movements are really essential to environmental restoration as well. And plants are really very clearly makers of landscapes and makers of place, and very much requiring living in particular conditions. So, and two, the amassment of colonial wealth, if we think about just the cotton plantations of the United States alone, this is something that is very hard to separate from human histories. So plant studies, I think, is having its moment now in a way that animal studies was having maybe a decade or more earlier than that. But there is a lot, I think, I hope, of that other people are seeing this these kinds of connections as not mutually exclusive at all.
It seems like plant sentience and plant communication is also part of that moment, right? In the wake of The Hidden Life of Trees coming out maybe a decade or so ago. And of course, plant sentience in literature is nothing all that new. And I know it's something you've written about, I think, in one of the encyclopedia entries you shared with me that you had authored. And I'm thinking of like the wise old Ents in The Lord of the Rings, or the giving tree, even from children's literature. These are plants that have thoughts, plants that have feelings. And those subgenres, whether it's fantasy or science fiction, we've seen those examples, but it seems like serious literary fiction now is also entertaining stories and characters that grapple with issues of plant sentience in different ways. And I think your forthcoming chapter, titled "From Tree Talk to Forest Thinking," examines how plant communication is represented in popular literary fiction. And specifically, you work with Richard Powers' The Overstory and Annie Proulx's Barkskins. So in that piece, if I may quote from your piece, you write, "I cannot help but wonder, why is fiction such a problem for popular science writing about plant communication in general, and for representing trees as breaking the horticulture of science?" Lovely turn of phrase, by the way, in particular. And you set out to, quote, "challenge the assumption that forest fictions are antithetical to plant science." So first I want to ask, why do you think this subgenre about plant whisperers has attracted such an avid readership now? And second, why is this a problem for some in the scientific community? Where's the friction?
Yeah, well, it has a sad history in some sense that just as people were coming to terms with our ethical treatment of animals in laboratories, this was probably the excesses of the 50s and 60s coming to public light, leading to the Animal Welfare Act in the U.S. and other legislation in other countries that really changed the rules for what was appropriate in science. And this was really driven by public sentiment and public understanding, and marked a real sea change in people's attitudes as having already grown up and been supported. And I think the 60s, it's not coincidental, the same idea of who was human and what people were included in the human fold was being challenged at the same time. Something similar, at least in terms of documenting the communicative capacities of plants, and there are just amazing and mind-blowing capacities, was starting to gain some traction in science, but unfortunately became popularized by the Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants, both the book, very popular book, and then there was this film, which Stevie Wonder does an excellent soundtrack for. Highly recommend the soundtrack, but the thing itself, the story itself, if it even can be called a story, is very trippy, is very psychedelic, is very hard to imagine 18 to 22-year-olds sitting quietly in a theater watching anymore by today's terms, and did a lot, unfortunately, to help the forces that wanted to discredit the science of the times, which isn't to say the science wasn't solid. It was that the science quickly was made to seem silly or inappropriate. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, because with this animal welfare questions too, they challenge not just my own personal decisions in my everyday life, but there are powerful industries behind a very narrow way of looking at other living beings as exploitable. And the history of human enslavement is very much one not exactly the same. Certainly there are very important differences, but I think we're all people who have hearts, and we understand that there are limits to what we can extract in the world, and the world is letting us know that now in a big way. So coming back to why this matters now and why in the 21st century these questions are being asked as never before, that's one question. But you asked a really good question too about what is it about the plant communicators in the 21st century, and how this science is getting a lot more validity and is being embraced now. Partly it's because, we have wildfire smoke in our air now from far away in Canada that has been fueled in part by plantation farming of trees and the lie that was somehow a renewable resource that we could monocrop and that somehow was the same as a forest. And we know now through this very good science and very brave and persistent and strong scientists who kept going against the odds and against these forces against them with proving again and again that we need to be doing this differently. That's one really clear reason, I think. Another is that creative writers, really good ones, are taking on this challenge of how to represent something that is so different to humans as plants. The philosopher Michael Marder has been someone who really has been a driving force in plant studies, and he really clarifies it, captures it in the phrase of thinking without a head. Thinking instead with a meristem that completely encapsulates your body and conceivably allows for infinite growth. That's not human experience at all. My dog's experience is not that either. I can understand a lot more of what's going on with other creatures, other animate creatures, thinking and responses and feelings, I think, than to creatively challenge myself to think about what is life from a tree's perspective. What is communication through chemical semaphores? What is life when it's dependent for its existence on figuring out how to communicate and share resources with something as different from me as a mycelium, a mushroom, which is what we now know trees can do. And, just saying this, I'm getting excited because it's so interesting and so fun. And I think general readership, once you get into it with a good writer, it's very hard not to share in that excitement and that curiosity and that interest. And we are so lucky that many scientists have committed themselves to writing. And I think it's not by accident. Suzanne Simard, Finding the Mother Tree is her autobiography. And in it, she's very clear that she had to make a decision at a certain point in her career that making her findings and the implications of them accessible to a wider public audience, it's a critical step that she needed to take for the future of the science and quite possibly for the future of forests on our planet, particularly old growth ones that are really in danger now and a tiny slice of what was once such a great source of life and beauty and, strength and wealth on our planet that need our help more than ever before and that we need the help of. That storytelling, I think, is super important. Another person who I just find so much inspiration from, and I think others are too, is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is much more explicit, and she herself as a trained botanist, a PhD botanist like Simard, but also she's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and as a Potawatomi adult language learner is coming into her culture as she's writing, and that there's something very important, again, about recovering Indigenous wisdom and histories that is so central to, I think, where plant studies can be going at its best. And again, it's a good moment right now to be thinking in these ways.
So do you think fiction writers do a disservice to plants when they anthropomorphize their communication? And I'm thinking of like some of those ones that I referenced earlier. Because their way of communicating is so very different. So on the one hand, I feel like that's a little bit unfair to the plant. But on the other hand, if we're trying to elicit sympathy from a human reader, that natural pivot seems to be make the plants more like us, make their communication something that seems more comparable to ours. So how do you sort of rectify those maybe competing ways of looking at plant communication, I guess, and how do you think contemporary fiction writers like Powers and Prue that you write about are navigating that line?
A great writerly question from a great writer, Josh. Thank you.
You're too kind.
Okay. So couple of things come to mind immediately, and that is, of course, the demonization of anthropomorphism, and then just as I just did it, the slide into anthropocentrism that's assumed to be the case every time it's invoked. And for so long, scientists were made to feel that they needed to resist it. That is sort of carrying over somewhat, I think, into what counts as legitimate or counts as rational ways of looking at the world. And that's also really limiting how we approach things. Certainly politically, especially with animal stories, there's no getting around the fact that anthropomorphic animal stories like Black Beauty, Beautiful Joe, and others were embraced by the animal rights movement because they changed people's hearts and minds. That said, an author like Upton Sinclair, author of The Jungle, which is the expose of the Chicago slaughterhouses, famously said also that he aimed for the heart, but got his readers inadvertently in the stomach. They responded not by animal welfare was generations later. Instead, what happened as a direct result of the popularity of that book was a lot of food standard and worker safety laws being put in. Granted, that work needed doing too, but yeah, his weren't anthropomorphic stories. So you are risking something by not, as you said, engaging people with the subjectivity, with the individuality of others. And yet there is also the risk that you are distorting it and projecting it and repeating the sins, as they are said to be, of anthropocentrism. So as a creative writer, in my heart, I guess, as a creative academic in my profession, I've always been attracted to the writers who resist that easy pull of anthropomorphism and instead try to represent communication as it's happening in real time. So one of the books that I wrote about in Animal Stories, and it's one of my all-time favorites, is titled My Dog Tulip. It's an autobiography of living with a very difficult German Shepherd, which now that I live with a German Shepherd, I appreciate all the more. But what's beautiful about it is that the author, J.R. Ackerley, resists putting words in Tulip's mouth, instead just describes how they are trying to live in a small apartment in 1950s London, and Tulip has a litter of puppies. It becomes very complicated. And all the while, he's imposing a narrative on her that she's resisting. And wordlessly, silently, but persistently resisting, she becomes a heroine in a way that you really don't see coming while reading. And it's just an incredible way in which he conveys, through just recording this intense relationship, his own shift in his mind and recognition of how he had interpolated all of this heteronormative narrative, and him as an out gay man in 1950s London, a really dangerous time for him to be who he was and own that. But when he turns to his dog, no, gotta be normal, gotta be normate, and normate is natural. And but Tulip says no. So forcefully and so beautifully that looking at the power of a story like that and how that is really happening and becoming popular in a certain crowd, literary crowd, that is also profoundly, as a forthcoming book by my friend Robert Ralston Mackay is documented much more clearly, directly influencing the animal rights movement, this kind of creative literary writing. It's very hard for me not to go looking in contemporary writing about plants for writers who are similarly trying to take plants on their own terms and trying to convey to readers what actually are the really amazing insights of science about how communication, how expression, how plants' lives are, what we know about them, and then trying to look out into the world and see that. And I think, as you mentioned, I write this article about Richard Powers' The Overstory and comparing it in some ways with Annie Proulx's Bark Skins, to see how both of these writers, who arguably are at the top of their game, Prule, maybe better known before she wrote Broke Skins for some great hits along the way, that one of which at least became a Hollywood movie. Powers, much more of a critical success before this is his really popular crossover novel. And that both of them are taking incredible risks. They're not taking the conservative, oh, this tree told me this, and then I was the tree's best friend, or what I love, the revision you mentioned, Shel Silverstein, the giving tree is now the tree who needs to set better boundaries.
That's great.
My students love that. Instead to have a novel like The Overstories start in a very bewildering way, with trees communicating by raining chemical signals down onto a character who we only learn by the end why it is she's receptive to this and the journey that she's gone on, which is incredible and involves all kinds of twists and turns that I don't want to ruin by giving away any spoilers.
Thank you.
And yet it also is a story that has a lot of the history of plant science, the history of plants in the U.S. Most people, if they've read any of it, have read the first substantive chapter, which focuses on the story of the tragedy of the American chestnut. There is quite a lot devoted to the frustrated attempts to do tree sitting and other pro-forest activism, mostly centered in North America, that really, I thought, set up a very interesting comparison with Annie Prule's approach, which in Bark Skins is very different. She's definitely writing a history of North America in the world, from the 17th century, from the colonial moment up through the present also. So it's a longer time frame, and one that is very episodic, but is also much more deeply invested in staging and restaging certain key moments in colonial history that I think for many readers in Maine especially will find fascinating, because it does involve such dramatic histories, not just of the forestry industry, which those of us who are of a certain vintage remember was still a big thing when we were kids, and has pretty much gone the way of the dodo, as they say. But at its heyday also involved such radical deforestation, and that set up horrific, large-scale wildfires that we today conveniently think of as happening in California or in Canada. We imagine it is so far from here, but no, it ravaged this landscape as well, and for the reasons that and with the stories that Prule documents too.
Well, it was such an interesting article for me to read, and now I have a couple of books to add to my summer reading list to get greater depth of insight into your excellent treatment of it in your piece. Susan, I've really enjoyed our talk today. We're running up against the clock, as they say, so final question, one last question. What are you going to do with the rest of the summer? Do you have another piece that you're working on now that this one's coming out, or are you going to take a little time away, or what do you have on the docket for the next month or two?
Oh, never time away, always too much to do. I'm a career academic, so there's tenure reviews to write, dissertations to examine, and one real fun thing that I'm working on is an article for a collection titled Monocultures, thinking both of monocropping in the vegetal world, but monocultures in the human world too, where I'm looking at pineapple narratives. So various ones from different time periods, representations of pineapples in literature. The story of the pineapple is, again, one of these great colonial histories that started, most people don't know, as this wild plant deep in the Amazon in South America. But we think of it now as synonymous with Hawaiian culture, which it became at the time period in which Hawaii was forcibly annexed to the United States. Hawaii, if anyone doesn't know that, you should be aware, was once an independent kingdom and was not because of U.S. involvement. But pineapples we now see all over the world as we travel with us. And so their colonial and now decolonial history is something that I'm looking at there.
Very interesting. Well, Susan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Josh. And thank you for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful podcast series.
That's it for this episode of Oh, the Humanities. As always, thanks for listening. And feel free to tell us what you thought of this conversation on the CGH social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.